Welcome, I'm Gary Dumbrill, and this is the first in a series on anti-oppressive social work. In this podcast, I'm going to be drawing on some of the content of the book Anti-Oppressive Social Work, Ways of Knowing, Talking and Doing that I wrote with Dr. June Ying Yi from Ryerson University. In later podcasts, I'm going to have June join me, and we're going to go a bit deeper into some of the issues of oppression and anti-oppression. In this first podcast in the series, I want to ask a simple question. Would you recognize oppression if you saw it? If down the street there was a group of people or a person being treated unfairly, would you be able to look and say, hang on a minute, that's not just unfair. That group of people is being oppressed. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, that's a silly question. Of course I'd recognize it. Some of you might even think it's an offensive question, particularly if you've got lived experience of oppression. But play along with me for a few minutes. I don't ask this question to insult anyone or offend anyone. It's a question I'm constantly asking myself, and I invite other people to ask the same question of themselves too. I suspect that the answer is, yeah, of course you would. Because it's easy to spot oppression, particularly if you've been on the receiving end of oppression. It's really easy to notice it when you see it. But what if it's not you being oppressed? Or what if it's not someone from a group that you're a part of that's being oppressed? What if it's someone who's being oppressed in a way that you've not got lived experience of? Would you still recognize it? Again, I expect that the answer to that is yes, but as I said, play along with me for a little, because I want to look at times where really well-intended people who understand oppression missed the fact that it was occurring. And I want to raise the question, could you or I fall into that trap? To make this challenge harder, I want us to think about big forms of oppression, what I call burning cross oppression, the kind you get when the Ku Klux Klan starts burning crosses on the edge of town, or worse still, on people's front lawns. Just to be clear, when I use the term burning cross, it's an analogy. It does refer to literal burning of crosses, but also refers to other forms of overt, in-your-face racism that is a direct and obvious immediate threat to people's lives and safety. I need to qualify why I'm asking the question in this way. Anti-oppression work does focus on and call out what I refer to as burning cross racism, but more often anti-oppressive social work addresses more subtle and insidious forms of oppression embedded in people's personal attitudes and biases, in the dominant culture, and everyday institutional practices. These forms of oppression can be just as deadly, but they're harder to recognize and name than a burning cross. If you're an anti-oppressive social worker, for sure, you will see and have to deal with burning cross racism, maybe more often than you think. But most of what you'll be dealing with is more subtle racism and undercover oppression that pushes people down from specific groups through harder to recognize processes and actions embedded in everyday life. I will deal with that kind of oppression in later podcasts. But I want to start with burning crosses, because if you can't spot the problem when people are burning crosses on someone's front lawn, you don't have a hope of recognizing and addressing the more subtle forms of oppression. So just how easy is it to spot burning cross racism? You would think that it's pretty easy, because there are moments in history and now when racism and oppression are so obvious that everybody gets it. A burning cross on someone's front lawn would be one of those moments. Another one of those moments is the Holocaust, and we often use this moment in history as a time that epitomizes oppression. On the one side you have Hitler and the Nazis, and they were doing the oppression, and on the other side we have the oppressed, and they included Jewish people, Romani, people with disabilities, members of the LGBTQ and related communities, and many more. If we made a list of moments in history where everybody should have understood that oppression was occurring, this would be somewhere at the top of that list. So given that, if we lived back then, would we have recognized it? And if we did recognize it for what it was, would we have been willing to do something about it? Another way of asking this question is to suppose for a moment that you and I lived back in those days, World War II. and we had the opportunity to do something at no risk to ourselves to stop someone going to a concentration camp, would we have done it? Before you answer that question, I'm going to tell you two brief interconnected stories from the era in the 1930s. But because the 1930s was so long ago, let me first of all tell you a little bit about what was happening during that decade. By the 1930s, Hitler had established himself and the Nazi Party in Germany. There was an increase in anti-Semitism and also oppression of other groups on the margins of German society. Hitler not only threatened the people on the margins within that society, he threatened other nations that bordered Germany and actually the rest of the world. He had a plan of world domination and a Reich that would last for 1,000 years that embodied his fascist and racist ideologies. So that is what was occurring in Germany and Europe. Meanwhile, in the East, 1937, Japan invades China. This story in the East is connected to the West in many ways, not least among them that China was giving refuge to Jewish people escaping Germany. There's other connections too, and it's beyond the scope of this episode to look at them, but I just want you to be aware of what's going on in the East. Meanwhile, in Europe, Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, had been trying to avoid war with Germany, but it was becoming increasingly obvious that war was inevitable. By the end of 1939, Britain and France and some other countries were at war with Germany, and the war continued to evolve around the world from that point on. So that's a really, really brief overview of the decade. So that contextualizes the decade within which the stories I'm about to tell unfold. A key player and orchestrator of both stories is Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi Minister of Propaganda. The first story starts on November the 9th, 1938, in an event that became known as Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. Nazi stormtroopers enacted a pre-orchestrated methodological attack on Jewish homes, businesses, schools, and synagogues throughout Germany and parts of Austria. Prior to the attack, Gestapo chief Heinrich Müller ordered the entire German police force to ignore what was happening and not defend Jewish people. I've heard other reports that it was Goebbels that issued this order. I'm thinking it would have come from Goebbels, but it would have been enacted through the SS, so Müller would have had to have enacted that order that came down from Goebbels. In the 2 days and nights that followed, tens of thousands of synagogues, Jewish homes, and Jewish shops were attacked. 92 Jewish people were killed, and approximately 30,000 were apprehended and sent to concentration camps. I could tell you more about this story, but let Hannah, Hirsch, Leibman take the story from here.
Kristallnacht, I went to school in the morning, Jewish school, obviously, and something seemed wrong, yet I didn't know what. And when I came to school and I mentioned that I saw the fire engines standing in front of a building, and in the back of this building was the Orthodox synagogue, I was told, "Don't you know what's going on?" And I said, "No, I don't." She said, "This one told me my father was arrested. This father was arrested, and it was just a terrible situation. The teachers, other than the female teachers, did not come in. They were arrested. And they sent us home, I think, after about 2 hours. And when I came home, all our show windows had been smashed. My mother was sweeping up the street, okay, to the taunts and harassment of the population, or the people who were made to look like population. Next to us was a store that dealt in oriental carpets. The show windows gone, ink thrown over the carpets. It was impossible.
We need to be clear that these events were not kept secret in Germany. They were reported globally in the world press. The press reported that the mob set fire to synagogues. Anti-Jewish violence does appalling damage in Germany. And the Los Angeles Examiner reported something that's really significant, and that is that the Nazis warned the world that the Jews will be wiped out unless evacuated by democracies. There was not only outrage in America, Canada, and other places about what was happening to Jewish people in Nazi Germany. There was also a promise of solidarity, standing with Jewish people to protect them in Germany. To capture that promise, I'm going to play you a brief news broadcast from that time. This news broadcast is going to use the word pogrom. The word pogrom means a riot directed against a religious group in an attempt to wipe them out or harm them. And the pogrom referred to in this broadcast is the events of November 1938 and the Night of Broken Glass.
The American people led the worldwide protest against the Nazi pogrom. Anti-Hitler demonstrations have taken place all over the country. The Jewish protest in this genuinely democratic nation was voiced by Chief Rabbi Wise.
American Jews are resolved, together with all other racial and religious groups in American life, to safeguard the equal rights of Jews at home and abroad.
Washington lined up with the people. Summoning his cabinet on learning of the Hitler pogrom, President Roosevelt took an unparalleled step. He recalled the American ambassador from Germany. So from the United States Embassy, full evidence of the atrocities is being taken by Ambassador Hugh Wilson to his president. Hitler retaliated by recalling his minister from Washington.
At this time, Canadian Prime Minister Mackenzie King also noted, I think it was in a speech in the Houses of Parliament, that the sorrows which the Jews have to bear at this time are almost beyond comprehension. So that is how 1938 ended. 1939 comes along and Goebbels has a new idea. And this new idea is the next story that I'm about to tell. Goebbels thought, what if we get a ship and let Jewish people leave Nazi Germany and go anywhere in the world they want to go? So he got that ship, and it was called the St. Louis. And this story unfolds roughly 6 months after the Night of Broken Glass. And that's what's significant here, because these stories are interconnected. In May 1939, 937 Jewish passengers board the St. Louis. They sail across the Atlantic to Cuba, arrive in Havana, but they weren't allowed to land. I think there was a handful that did manage to land. I also heard that someone committed suicide because they were worried the ship was going to be turned back to Nazi Germany. The St. Louis then sailed up the coastline of the United States, hoping to find refuge in the United States, which is a good assumption given the solidarity the Americans promised just 6 months before. But the US Coast Guard stood them off. They messaged over to Canada to see if Canada would give them refuge. Canada's response was no. No with a vengeance. It wasn't no, sorry, we've just got lots of unemployment, or there's nowhere for you to stay, or this isn't really a good time for us to give you refuge. The reply was none would be too many. Something really significant in terms of the way oppression operates is occurring right in this moment. So I want us to pause for a moment and just hear what it was like for someone who was living this moment. Let's hear from Gerda, Blachman, Wilchfort about what happened.
Well, as you can imagine, there was a terrible mood. Everybody was very depressed. But, humans are always hopeful. We always cling to the hope something is going to happen. They're not going to let us rot on the ocean. I mean, something had to happen to us. Of course, the fear was that we would go back to Germany. That was a big thing, So the food got worse and worse, and water supply. I mean, we had water, but we had to be careful. And of course, the parties were over. No more parties. No more fun. We were just sitting and waiting what's going to happen. And here again, the committee tried everything and sent telegrams all over the world trying to get us in, but it was every day they had like newsletters printed and put out on board to tell us what's happening, and every day there was another country we were supposedly going to go, but we never, and nothing came about till finally we were already, well, first we came to the coast of Miami, and we thought we can, I heard later that the captain had agreed that we make some kind of a forced landing or something, but we didn't know anything about it. We just saw the Coast Guard boats surround us near Miami to make sure that we wouldn't even come close to shore. So that was out. So we saw the lights of Miami, we saw the lights of America, and that was it. So we slowly sailed back to Europe, and of course behind there was a lot of negotiations going on with the United Jewish Appeal, and there was a Mr. Topper in Paris, and he finally got it together that we will be divided between Belgium and Holland and France and England.
Gerda's story ends there, but the events continue because when Germany invaded Holland, France and Belgium, those people who had escaped on the St. Louis and found refuge there were located, rounded up and sent to concentration camps like Auschwitz. I visited Auschwitz once, and I stood in the middle of Auschwitz too, and every direction I looked, the camp extended to the horizon. This was oppression and genocide on an industrial scale. So what's going on here? Just 6 months previously, newspapers in the United States, the Canadian Prime Minister, and others lamented what was going on for Jewish people. Remember from the news headlines we looked at after the night of broken glass. One newspaper headline said that unless the United States and other countries took refugees from Nazi Germany, Jewish people there would be wiped out. So just 6 months after those headlines, an opportunity comes to take in refugees and they're turned away. I'm not going to pretend that I understand or can explain what's going on in this moment, but I suspect that Goebbels can. I expect that Goebbels knew that despite the United States and Canada expressing outrage at anti-Semitism in Nazi Germany, that anti-Semitism also existed in these countries. Maybe not on the same scale as it did at that moment in Nazi Germany, but certainly to the extent that it would result in the St. Louis being turned around and the passengers not being able to disembark. Why else would Goebbels have organized this? After all, he was the minister of propaganda. So we need to look for propaganda within this exercise that he orchestrated. I need to also add here that when the St. Louis was looking for refuge in the United States and Canada, there were a number of people in Canada and the US actually who argued that they should be given refuge. So I want to acknowledge that and give a nod to those people who stood up and said something, but it wasn't enough to carry the day. So Goebbels took a gamble that those people who argued for giving Jewish refugees refuge would be defeated by people who had the opposite view. So how come it played out like that? How come people who protested anti-Semitism in Germany and promised solidarity 6 months before turned their backs on Jewish people who needed refuge in the moment when they needed it? I don't have an answer to that, and I think it's okay not to have an answer, because I think it's one of those things that we shouldn't just wrap up, put on a shelf and say, oh, I've got that answer. It's something that we should continually think about and be troubled over. With that troubling in mind, at the beginning of this episode, I asked 2 questions. One is whether you could recognize oppression if it was occurring. And the second one was if you had the opportunity to stop and prevent, at no risk to yourselves, someone from going to a concentration camp, would you do it? And I'm sure we all answered yes to both of them. Yeah, we would recognize oppression. And yeah, of course, we would intervene and stop someone if they were going to be shipped off to a concentration camp. But if that is so, we need to be able to explain what the difference between us and the 1939 generation is. Because they said they were going to do something, and they didn't. And I don't think we can explain it by saying that they were just mean, they weren't as sensitive or in tune with oppression as we were, because the evidence doesn't support that. And a few months after this, they signed up and went, and many gave their lives to fight fascism. So I don't think that they were really that different to us. And that should trouble us. And it needs to trouble us. The reason it needs to trouble us is because they missed what I called at the beginning of this episode, burning cross racism. So if they missed that, where are the burning crosses that we are missing today, or that some of us are missing today, so that society as a whole is not getting mobilized to do something about it? Now, I need to add that Canadian society as a whole, via our Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, has in 2018 apologized for not giving refuge to the people on the St. Louis. We've apologized for other things too, the residential school, the 60s scoop, and so on. Collectively, as a society, we needed to offer those apologies. But the other thing we need to do is to think 50 years ahead and ask what is it that generation is going to be apologizing for on our behalf. Because if the 1939 generation missed what I've called burning cross racism and didn't do anything about it, what burning crosses are we missing right now? And when I say we, I'm not referring to you as an individual, because you as an individual may be tapping into recognizing and doing something about all kinds of oppression that are occurring today. I might mean you if you're not aware of any oppression occurring today, but specifically I'm really talking about us as a society as a whole, collectively taking a stand and doing something about oppression. So how do we do that? And how do we make sure we're not making the same kind of mistakes as they were making in 1939? I also need to add here that I'm not suggesting St. Louis was the only mistake that was being made in 1939. There are a whole number of other mistakes that were occurring then and are continuing to occur now. I'm just focusing on the St. Louis as one example. The other thing I should add is that some people would argue it wasn't a mistake, it was actually deliberate to leave those people to go back to Nazi Germany. That may be true, but I call it a mistake because Canada has apologized, which means at least there's some recognition that that should not have happened, which makes it a good example of the kind of thing we need to avoid in the future. But how do we avoid that mistake in the future? And how do we avoid the mistakes like that we're doing now? There are no easy answers to that. I can't say, here you go, do this or do that or avoid doing this, and you've got it covered, you've got anti-oppression figured out. It's not as simple as that. There are some things we can do and many things we need to keep in mind, and we're going to be looking at those in this series. In the meantime, before I wrap up this episode, let me tell you what I do in class when I teach this topic. I put on a PowerPoint slide a sentence, but I squash all the letters together so there's no gaps between the words, and then I add in capitalization in all the wrong places to make it difficult to see where the words begin and end. I ask students to then make sense of the sentence to see if they can read it, and if they look at it really, really hard and spend time, some of them can pick out what's happening, others still can't. And that's exactly what you would expect. There's nothing wrong with students who can't make sense of that. And then I separate the words out with the next slide so they're all spaced out and all the fake capitalization has been removed. Everyone can then either read what the sentence says or have it read to them. I then suggest that life is like the first sentence, not the second one. That events get compressed together, that Capitalization is put in the wrong place, by which I mean that the discourse is spun in a certain way and misinformation is added so that it becomes much more difficult to see what's going on. Sure, you can read what's going on if you spend a lot of time and really focus, but even if you get a glimpse of what's going on, it's easy to lose sight of it again in the hustle of life, particularly if it's not something that impacts you directly or a community that you're involved in. So I suggest that that's how oppression masks itself sometimes within society. And also, if it's a form of oppression that resonates with some of the prejudices and biases that you have individually, that's going to make it harder. And also the fact that by definition, anything that is a form of oppression is going to be embedded in the dominant culture and also in social institutions. We'll come back to why that is so in a later episode. So keep that difficult to read sentence in mind, because the things we need to do to be able to make sense of that sentence are going to work as an analogy for some of the things we need to do to recognize and name oppression. So I'm hoping in those stories from the 1930s, there's things that we can use when we're moving forward with this series to try and understand and make sense of oppression today, and then also figuring out how we name it and then how we do something about it. So that's it for this episode, and I will see you next time.